There's a pattern that's repeated throughout history, across every major conflict, in every century, on every continent. While millions die in trenches, in bombed cities, in concentration camps, a select group of families gets unimaginably rich. Not just wealthy, not just successful, rich beyond comprehension, rich enough to buy governments, rich enough to start wars, rich enough to end them, and rich enough to make sure you never learn their names. The Krupps of Germany made billions arming both sides of 2 world wars. The Ponts of America turned gunpowder into a chemical empire worth hundreds of billions. The Vickers family of Britain sold weapons to every nation in Europe, then watched those same weapons tear the continent apart. These aren't isolated cases. These aren't accidents. This is the business model. Create demand through conflict. Supply weapons to all sides. Profit from human suffering. And when the smoke clears, use that blood money to buy respectability, political influence, and historical amnesia. This is the story of the secret war profiteers, the families that built generational wealth on the graves of soldiers, the dynasties that shaped the modern world through calculated violence, and the system they created that still operates today, more sophisticated and more profitable than ever before. Because what I'm about to show you isn't ancient history. It's the blueprint for how power really works, how wars really start, and why they never seem to end. Before we dive into the families, you need to understand what war profiteering actually is. Not the sanitized textbook definition, the reality. War profiteering is the deliberate exploitation of armed conflict for financial gain. It's selling weapons, supplies, and services to warring parties at massive markups during times of desperate need. It's creating artificial shortages to drive up prices. It's bribing officials to secure no-bid contracts. And most importantly, it's using political influence to ensure conflicts continue long enough to maximize profits. The mathematics are simple and brutal. During peacetime, a rifle might cost $50 to produce and sell for $75. During wartime, that same rifle costs $50 to produce but sells for $300. Ammunition that costs pennies becomes worth dollars. Medical supplies see 1,000% markups, and governments pay whatever is asked because soldiers are dying and time is running out. But here's what makes war profiteering different from regular wartime price increases. War profiteers don't just respond to conflicts. They create them. They fund both sides. They prolong fighting through weapons sales and strategic financing. They turn regional disputes into global wars because global wars generate global profits. This isn't opportunism. This is orchestration. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. During World War II, American war profiteers made $56 billion in net profits. That's nearly $1 trillion in today's money. 22,000 new millionaires were created in just 4 years. The number of billion-dollar corporations jumped from 32 to 44. Wall Street became the world's banker, and all of it was built on a foundation of industrial-scale death. Every time blood was spilled anywhere in the world, American monopolists raked in $933. Every time an American soldier fell in battle, Wall Street registered $52,000 in blood profits. These aren't metaphors. These are the actual calculations. Human lives converted into shareholder value with mathematical precision. The Krupp dynasty stands as the most notorious example of multi-generational war profiteering in history. For over 300 years, from 1587 to 1968, the Krupp family armed Germany through every major conflict. When Prussia marched in 1870, it was Krupp cannons that blasted through French defences. When Germany mobilised in 1914, Krupp factories supplied the artillery that turned Belgium into a wasteland. When Hitler launched his war of extermination in 1939, Krupp steel became the backbone of the Nazi war machine. The dynasty began innocently enough. In 1587, a trader named Arndt Krupp moved to Essen and joined the Merchants' Guild. He bought and sold real estate, accumulated wealth, became one of the city's richest men. His descendants started small, producing guns during the 30 Years' War, acquiring mills and forges, slowly building an industrial base. But it was Alfred Krupp, born in 1812, who transformed the family from merchants into merchants of death. Alfred Krupp became known as the Cannon King. He invested heavily in new steel technology, revolutionized artillery production, and created the first truly modern weapons manufacturing system. By the time he died in 1887, he had armed 46 nations. 46. His factories supplied weapons to countries that were actively at war with each other. German guns killed French soldiers, French guns killed German soldiers, and Alfred Krupp collected payment from both sides. But here's what made the Krupps truly dangerous. They understood that sustainable war profiteering required more than just weapons manufacturing. It required social control. Alfred introduced sick pay, free hospitals, pensions, and housing for his workers. He created a paternalistic system where entire communities depended on the Krupp factories for survival. When Germany went to war, Essen went with it, not out of patriotism, but out of economic necessity. This model of combining social welfare with weapons production created unprecedented worker loyalty. Krupp employees didn't just build cannons, they believed in the mission. They saw themselves as defenders of the fatherland, protectors of their families, guardians of German industrial might. The reality was simpler and darker. They were cogs in a profit machine that fed on international conflict. The 20th century brought the Krupps to their ultimate expression of evil. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach married into the family in 1906 and assumed the Krupp name. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, Gustav immediately aligned the company with the Nazi regime. Krupp factories became the centre of German rearmament. The family didn't just support Hitler, they enabled him. After 1939, Krupp built factories in occupied territories across Europe. They used slave labour on an industrial scale. Over 100,000 concentration camp inmates worked in Krupp facilities. 70,000 of them died from the conditions, the brutality, the deliberate murder disguised as industrial production. The company built a fuse factory inside Auschwitz, inside the most notorious death camp in history. Krupp was manufacturing weapons components using Jewish slave labour. This wasn't a company that happened to benefit from Nazi policies. This was a company that helped design those policies. Gustav's son, Alfred, who took control in 1943, worked directly with SS leadership to optimize slave labor utilization. They calculated calorie requirements to maximize work output before death. They designed punishment systems to maintain discipline. They created a corporate death machine that generated profits from human suffering on an unprecedented scale. When Germany lost the war, the Allies tried Alfred Krupp as a war criminal. He was convicted of plunder and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to sell 75% of his holdings. Justice served, right? Wrong. In 1951, as the Cold War intensified, American occupation authorities released him. In 1953, he resumed control of the company. By 1960, he was one of the richest men in Germany again. The Krupp story reveals the central truth about war profiteering dynasties. They don't just survive political transitions, they orchestrate them. They don't just adapt to new conflicts, they create them. And they don't just profit from human suffering. They systematize it, optimize it, and pass those systems down through generations like family recipes. But the Krupps were just one family in one country. The real story of war profiteering is global, interconnected, and still operating today. The DuPonts built an American chemical empire on gunpowder profits. The Vickers family armed the British Empire and half of Europe. And in the shadows, connecting them all, were the banking dynasties that financed every side of every conflict. The DuPont dynasty represents the American version of the Krupp model. Industrial-scale death production disguised as patriotic business enterprise. In 1802, Eleuthère Irénée Dupont, a French immigrant fleeing revolution, built a gunpowder mill on the Brandywine River in Delaware. Small operation, family business, modest profits supplying local miners and hunters. But wars change everything, and wars change the DuPonts from shopkeepers into American aristocracy. The War of 1812 was their first taste of government contracts. Federal money flowing directly into DuPont coffers. Gunpowder for American cannons, explosives for American soldiers. Profits that dwarfed anything they'd made in peacetime. This wasn't accident. This was revelation. War meant wealth. Government meant guaranteed customers. Death meant dividends. By the Civil War, the DuPonts had perfected the formula. They supplied gunpowder to Union forces while secretly selling components to Confederate manufacturers. Brother killing brother with DuPont explosives. Blue uniforms and grey uniforms, same supplier, same profit margins, same calculated indifference to which Americans died as long as someone paid for the privilege of killing them. The numbers tell the story. Before the Civil War, the DuPont company was worth roughly $200,000. After 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter, they were worth over $4 million. 20-fold increase. Built on American blood, funded by American taxpayers, celebrated as American success. But World War I elevated the DuPonts from wealthy to untouchable. In 4 years of European carnage, their fortune exploded from $74 million to $329 million. 458% return on investment. Not from innovation, not from efficiency, from selling explosives to governments desperate enough to pay any price for the tools of mass murder. Ferdinand Lundberg documented the specifics in his exposé of America's ruling families. Every shell that exploded in French trenches generated profit for the DuPonts. Every artillery barrage that turned Belgian cities into rubble increased their dividend payments. Every poison gas attack that choked soldiers to death in no man's land boosted their stock price. The mathematics of death converted directly into shareholder value. The company's transformation during this period reveals the sophisticated evolution of war profiteering. The DuPonts didn't just manufacture gunpowder. They diversified into every aspect of military supply: chemical weapons, high explosives, artillery shells, rifle cartridges. They created vertical integration of death, raw materials to finished products, cradle-to-grave control of the killing process. More importantly, they used wartime profits to buy peacetime protection. Massive investments in chemical research, patent acquisition across multiple industries, political contributions to key senators and congressmen. The DuPonts understood that war profiteering only works if you can survive the peace, so they built legitimate businesses that could operate during non-conflict periods while maintaining capacity for rapid wartime expansion. The 1930s brought congressional investigations into munitions makers. The Nye Committee called the DuPont to testify about their wartime profits. Lamos, Pierre, and Irénée DuPont faced hostile questioning about blood money. The press labelled them merchants of death. Public opinion turned against the family that had armed America's enemies while profiting from American suffering. But here's what the investigations missed. The DuPonts weren't just responding to wars, they were helping create them, through strategic political contributions, through lobbying for military build-ups, through international business relationships that required ongoing conflicts to remain profitable. The congressional hearings focused on profits. They should have focused on policy, because by World War II, the DuPonts had perfected the system. They weren't just selling to the American government. They were helping design American military strategy. Company executives served on government committees that determined weapons procurement. DuPont research facilities developed new explosives that only DuPont factories could manufacture. They created demand for products only they could supply. The Manhattan Project brought this relationship to its logical conclusion. The DuPont Company received the contract to build plutonium production facilities at Hanford. They constructed the reactors that produced the fissile material for the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 200,000 civilians incinerated with DuPont technology, the ultimate expression of war profiteering. Not just profiting from death, engineering new forms of death for profit. The post-war period should have ended their dominance. Nuclear weapons made conventional explosives obsolete. Chemical manufacturing became competitive. Government contracts became scrutinized. But the DuPonts had spent a century building something more valuable than any single product line. They had built institutional capture. DuPont executives moved seamlessly between corporate positions and government agencies. Former Pentagon officials joined DuPont boards. DuPont scientists led government research programs. The revolving door between public service and private profit became institutionalized, normalized, expected. This pattern repeated across the entire military-industrial complex. The Vickers family in Britain followed an identical model. William Vickers inherited his father's steel company in 1873 and immediately focused on weapons manufacturing. Vickers Limited became the largest arms manufacturer in Europe. They supplied battleships to the Royal Navy, artillery to the British Army, and secretly, weapons to every potential enemy of Britain. The business model was brilliant in its simplicity. Sell advanced weapons to Britain's allies, then sell slightly more advanced weapons to Britain's enemies. Create an arms race where every technological advancement required new purchases from both sides. German dreadnoughts, armed with Vickers guns, faced British destroyers armed with Vickers torpedoes. Italian submarines built with Vickers steel hunted French cruisers protected by Vickers armour. The Vickers family understood something fundamental about international relations. Countries don't go to war because they hate each other. They go to war because they think they can win, and they think they can win because arms dealers convince them they have superior weapons. The Vickers sales strategy wasn't just about moving product, it was about managing perceptions of military capability across multiple nations simultaneously. World War I represented the culmination of this strategy. Vickers had spent 40 years arming every major power in Europe. When the shooting started, every army was using Vickers weapons to kill soldiers equipped with other Vickers weapons. The company collected payment from Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Not sequentially, simultaneously. The human cost was staggering. 20 million dead, 21 million wounded, entire generations wiped out. But for Vickers, it was the most profitable period in company history. Stock prices tripled. Dividend payments reached record levels. The family fortune expanded from millions to hundreds of millions. And when the war ended, Vickers didn't scale back production. They pivoted to supplying the colonial conflicts, civil wars, and regional disputes that filled the power vacuum left by European exhaustion. Spanish Civil War, Chinese warlord conflicts, Latin American revolutions. Everywhere violence erupted, Vickers weapons appeared, not coincidentally, strategically. The interwar period brought new challenges and new opportunities. The Washington Naval Treaty limited battleship construction. The League of Nations promoted disarmament. International peace movements gained political influence. War profiteers faced the terrifying prospect of actual peace threatening their business model. Their response was sophisticated and effective. Instead of opposing disarmament directly, they supported treaties that favoured their existing product lines while restricting competitor technologies. Instead of fighting peace movements, they funded research into defensive weapons that required continuous modernisation. Instead of relying on government contracts alone, they expanded into civilian markets that could rapidly convert to military production. Most importantly, they began coordinating internationally. The Krupps, Ponts, and Vickers families weren't competitors. They were partners in a global enterprise that required careful market management. Secret agreements divided territories. Technology sharing prevented any single nation from gaining decisive advantage. Price coordination ensured profitable margins regardless of which side won any particular conflict. This coordination extended beyond manufacturing into finance, politics, and information control. The same banks that loaned money to weapons manufacturers also financed government military budgets. The same newspapers that reported on international tensions were owned by investors with stakes in defense companies. The same politicians who voted for military appropriations received campaign contributions from arms dealers. By the 1930s, war profiteering had evolved from opportunistic exploitation into systematic social control. The military-industrial complex wasn't just responding to conflicts, it was creating the conditions that made conflicts inevitable, and profitable, and endless. The transformation accelerated as World War II approached. What had been a loose coordination between families became a sophisticated international network. The war profiteers didn't just anticipate the coming conflict, they engineered it. Through strategic arms sales that destabilized regional balances, through financial backing of extremist movements that promised expanded military spending, through calculated intelligence sharing that ensured no side gained decisive early advantage. The Krupp-Dupont-Vickers triangle represented only the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Behind these manufacturing dynasties stood the banking families that made everything possible. The Rothschilds financed government bonds that paid for weapons purchases. The Morgans underwrote corporate expansion that enabled rapid wartime production scaling. The Warburgs managed international currency flows that allowed arms deals across enemy lines. This financial infrastructure created something unprecedented in human history. Wars that were profitable regardless of outcome. Conflicts designed not for territorial gain or ideological victory, but for maximum wealth extraction from all participating nations. The goal wasn't winning. The goal was continuation. Endless cycling between preparation, conflict, reconstruction, and preparation again. World War II demonstrated the system's full maturation. American companies didn't just supply the Allied war effort. They maintained business relationships with Nazi Germany throughout the conflict. Ford manufactured vehicles for the Wehrmacht while building tanks for the US Army. General Motors produced trucks for German forces while supplying aircraft engines to American bombers. IBM provided data processing systems that organized Holocaust logistics while computing Allied supply chains. The DuPont reached new heights of profitable cynicism. Their German subsidiary, DuPont de Nemours, operated chemical plants using slave labor from concentration camps. Simultaneously, their American operations received massive government contracts to produce explosives for destroying those same German facilities. They collected payment for building the infrastructure and payment for demolishing it. Perfect circular profit generation. But the real innovation came in post-war planning. The smart war profiteers understood that 1945 wouldn't mean peace. It would mean transition to a new form of profitable conflict. The Cold War offered everything traditional warfare provided without the messy inconvenience of actual battles between major powers. Permanent military build-up, proxy conflicts in developing nations, technological arms races that required constant modernization. The nuclear age should have ended conventional war profiteering. Atomic weapons made traditional military hardware obsolete. Mutual assured destruction eliminated major power conflicts. Global annihilation risk should have created incentives for genuine peace. Instead, it created new markets for more sophisticated forms of death. The military-industrial complex adapted brilliantly. Nuclear weapons required uranium mining, enrichment facilities, delivery systems, early warning networks, and command structures. Each component represented massive government contracts. Better yet, nuclear arsenals required constant maintenance, periodic modernization, and continuous expansion to counter enemy advances. Conventional weapons didn't disappear, they proliferated. Nuclear powers couldn't risk direct confrontation, so they fought through proxies. Korean War, Vietnam War, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, American interventions in Latin America. Every proxy conflict consumed conventional weapons at unprecedented rates. Small wars became more profitable than large ones because they lasted longer and required continuous resupply. The Eisenhower administration's military-industrial complex warning came too late. By 1961, the system had achieved regulatory capture so complete that government officials couldn't distinguish between national security interests and corporate profit motives. Defense contractors wrote their own procurement requirements. Pentagon officials planned post-retirement careers with weapons manufacturers. Congressional representatives received campaign contributions tied directly to military spending in their districts. Vietnam represents the apotheosis of this captured system. A war fought not for strategic objectives, but for profit maximization. American forces used more ammunition in Vietnam than in all of World War II, not because the enemy was more numerous or better equipped, but because continuous consumption generated continuous revenue. Helicopter manufacturers lobbied for tactics that required more helicopters. Chemical companies promoted defoliation strategies that consumed massive quantities of herbicides. Electronics firms pushed surveillance technologies that required constant upgrading. The human cost was incalculable. 58,000 American deaths, 2 million Vietnamese civilian casualties, environmental devastation that persists 50 years later. But for war profiteers, Vietnam was the perfect conflict. Long duration, unclear objectives, public support sufficient to prevent withdrawal, but insufficient to demand victory. Maximum resource consumption with minimum risk of actual resolution. The lesson wasn't lost on subsequent generations of war profiteers: Iraq War, Afghanistan War, Libya intervention, Syrian conflict. Each followed the Vietnam model. Overwhelming initial force followed by extended occupation requiring continuous logistical support. Nation-building contracts for the same companies that supplied the destruction. Reconstruction projects designed to fail so they could be rebuilt again. Halliburton's Iraq contracts exemplify modern war profiteering sophistication. Dick Cheney served as company CEO from 1995 to 2000. As vice president from 2001 to 2009, he received deferred compensation from Halliburton, while the company received $39 billion in no-bid Iraq contracts. The revolving door between government service and corporate profit had become a turnstile. But Halliburton represented only one node in a much larger network. KBR handled logistics, Blackwater provided security, DynCorp managed training, Bechtel handled reconstruction. Each company employed former government officials. Each company hired current government officials after their public service ended. Each company contributed to political campaigns of officials who voted on their contracts. The system had achieved something the original war profiteering families could never have imagined. Legal, institutionalized, permanent conflict as business model. Wars that didn't end because ending wasn't profitable. Government agencies that existed to manage conflicts rather than resolve them. Political systems that required external enemies to justify internal resource allocation. Modern war profiteering operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Defense contractors supply weapon systems. Private military companies provide personnel. Consulting firms manage information warfare. Technology companies enable surveillance states. Financial institutions facilitate international arms deals. Each sector depends on the others. Each sector profits from continued instability. 3 centuries of evidence proves the pattern never changes. The families evolve, the weapons modernize, the conflicts shift geography. But the fundamental business model remains identical. Create instability, supply all sides, profit from human suffering. Today's defense contractors aren't different from yesterday's cannon kings. They're more sophisticated, more integrated, more untouchable. The same blood money that built the Krupps factories now funds Silicon Valley surveillance systems. The same political corruption that protected DuPont explosives now shields Raytheon missiles. The system doesn't break, it adapts. And it's operating right now in conflicts you're watching on the news, generating profits for families whose names you'll never know. Because the greatest trick war profiteers ever pulled wasn't hiding their crimes. It was making you believe this is how the world naturally works,